Okay, everybody, welcome back to Unit 2 for American 1. So where we left off previously was after the Boston Massacre trial. So if you remember, after we did our activity in class, I told you that what actually happened at the end of the case was that all of Preston's, well, sorry, not all, 6 of Preston's men, including Preston, were found not guilty, and 2 were found guilty. So they were branded and then sent back to Great Britain. So a positive thing to come out of that is that we definitely saw that the jury was able to put aside their own biases, because we know that people in Boston especially, not giant fans of the Redcoats and the British military at this moment. So they were able to put aside their prejudices against those guys and were able to come out with the verdict that they thought was necessary, which is a positive thing for criminal justice as a whole. But what we are seeing now is, a lot of fracturing among the colonists, between the colonists and the British. It's just a really hard time. But as I've said 1,000 times, it is just harder in Boston for some reason. Everybody is feeling sort of the most angst, and all of the chaos is really centered in Boston. So in May of 1773, something is going to really exacerbate all of that, and that's going to be revolving around tea. So this is going to be revolving around, I guess, technically the Tea Act. So before I get into the Tea Act, we got to get a little bit of background. There's a company called the East India Tea Company, or the East India Company, and they were a massive global company who did a lot of business in Great Britain, and they were going broke, having a lot of financial problems. And as we've seen here in the present day, and with economic problems and big companies in the past, whether it be banks or automobile companies, that's just what is popping into my head at the current moment. But there's been tons of companies in the history of the United States, especially in the last 20 years, who have been really crucial to our economy. And so if they go broke, that will do very devastating things to our economy. And so the government feels like they need to step in and give the company what we call a bailout, which is essentially they're giving the company a bunch of money, or they're giving the company the ability to make a bunch of money to help pull them out of this old economic crisis and into a better economic situation for the overall benefit of the country. So, for example, when I think it was Bank of America was about to go under, and that would have caused some absolutely massive catastrophes here in the United States for our stock market and our economy as a whole. So President Obama and his administration passed 2 bailout packages totaling over $1 billion in order to bail out that bank and save the economy. They thought that was the best move. Now, obviously, there's varying opinions on whether or not bailouts are actually a good solution, or whether they're just a band-aid. There's a lot of debate. But that's not what we're going to talk about now. What we're going to talk about is how the British are going to do a bailout here, and they're going to use one on the East India Tea Company. Now, they're not going to write a big fat check for the East India Tea Company. What they're going to do is they're going to give the tea company, the ability to make a bunch of money. So what they're going to do is they are going to pass something called the Tea Act in May of 1773. Now, what they're going to do is, this is not a tax on tea, okay? That's not what the Tea Act is. I don't want you to think that. The Tea Act actually establishes a monopoly for the East India Tea Company in the colonies. If you remember back with the Navigation Act of 1660, legally speaking, the colonies can only get their products from Great Britain. Now, there are a multitude of, companies in Great Britain that they can buy their products from, but it's only, British government and British businesses that they can buy stuff from. Now they're even further restricting that here by saying that the EITC is the only company that they can actually buy their tea from. This allows the EITC to be able to sell their surplus of tea, but they can also sell it at really whatever price they want to sell it at. So this is very bad for colonial consumers and customers, because their costs are going to significantly increase. This is also really bad because if they wanted to, it's basically, twofold bad. One, they could raise their prices, which is bad for the consumer, but two, they could drop their prices and sell tea for very, 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 very low prices. Now, why would that be bad for the colonial economy? That's because now colonists would start buying their tea from this company instead of from smugglers. And smuggling is such a crucial part of the economy now that if people just stop buying smuggled goods, it would damage the economy. So this is just bad all around. So the colonists fiercely resent this, especially the Sons of Liberty. If you remember, I told you that Sam Adams and John Hancock, two of the founding members of the Sons of Liberty, Sam Adams being really the one in charge of it all, they're both smugglers. And so this is very bad for their business, and they know that this is a dangerous road that they're heading down. So they call for a tea boycott, and they begin organizing this with the Daughters of Liberty, encouraging people not to buy tea from the East India Tea Company. If you want to buy tea, buy smuggled tea, whatever. Now, things get worse when Thomas Hutchinson, if you remember, we talked about him. He's the new governor of Massachusetts, who is determined to, collect the money in mob rule in Boston, all of the above. He is determined to make the money off of these tea sales. He is, the reason he's so determined, though, is because he names two of his sons and his nephew as the tea agents to sell the shipment, meaning that they're going to be the ones who make the highest commission off of this new shipment of tea coming in. Makes sense that he would want to make sure that they are able to be successful. They won't be successful if the Sons of Liberty are successful. So when this new massive amount of tea comes in December of 1773, the Sons of Liberty start thinking, what can we do? We need something bigger than a boycott. We need something to really show them that we are not going to just take this lying down. We don't want their tea. If that's what if this is what they're going to do, we don't even want the product. So what they ultimately come up with, it was actually a Daughter of Liberty's idea. The Sons of Liberty are going to dress up as Mohawk Indians, board the ship when it comes into the harbor, and dump all of the tea. So they dump 342 chests of tea into the Boston Harbor, and that event becomes known as the Boston Tea Party. That cargo costs about 90,000 pounds in, British pound sterling. It costs about 90,000 pounds. In US dollars, that is close to $2 million. That's just insane. That's a ridiculous amount of money. They literally just threw $2 million into the harbor. They basically lit $2 million on fire. So the British government's reaction to this is going to be a severe one. So by this time, Great Britain is pretty much fed up with the colonies and with Boston in particular. So when they hear about what happened with the Boston Tea Party, what they're going to do now is essentially put Boston in timeout. They've got this one kid who won't stop acting up. They've tried, talking to this child. They've tried negotiating, how can I make this kid happy? I don't know how to please them. Nothing they are able to figure out is working. So here come punishments at this point. So we're really going to see the British start to crack down, especially on Boston. In 1774, they're going to pass a series of laws called the Coercive Acts, and the colonists are going to call them the Intolerable Acts. So it's the same thing. If you hear me or if you read somewhere something about the coercive laws or the Intolerable Acts, they're the same thing. So they're going to do a multitude of things. These laws are, number one, they're going to close down the Boston Harbor. Boston is basically the capital for the Revolution. So that city caused the Crown far more problems than any other. The British Crown thinks that there is a conspiracy in Boston to ignite a rebellion and achieve independence from Great Britain. Now, is there? Not exactly. Nobody's talking about independence much. There are a few people talking about independence, but overall, most people, not even most people in Boston, are talking about independence. They're talking about sticking it to the British and, getting the British government off their back. But as far as independence, that's not really something that's happening. But that is something that the government thinks that they're doing. They think, that they're all sitting around trying to come up with a way to get their independence. The second thing it's going to do is forbid town meetings in Boston. The reason why they're going to do this is because they want to prevent the colonists from, communicating with each other in mass quantities. They want to cut down on the likelihood that Sam Adams, is going to call some meeting and encourage a rebellion or incite some other type of massive protest that hurts the British government. The next thing it does is it passes a new law where no colonial governmental position can be chosen by the colonists now. So remember I told you that the people monitoring the ports and the tax collectors and stuff, those were now going to be chosen by the British government. Well, now every single government official in the colonies is going to be appointed by the British government. So they're taking away every single colonist's right to choose their own governmental leaders, even in the colonies. That's a big problem for people. Another thing that it's going to do is it's going to say that any government official in the colonies who has to be put on trial for a crime, that trial will take place in Great Britain. So that means that if a governor is corrupt and the colonists want to put him on trial for that, they couldn't even do that. The British government would have to do that. The likelihood that they would do that is much lower. So this is just taking away some serious fundamental rights for the British, and people are extremely, extremely upset about this. And a lot of it is really targeting Boston. By closing down the Boston Harbor, they're cutting them off from communication with other colonies, as well as economically. This is really going to damage the Boston economy, and this is going to do a lot of damage for the relationship between the colonists and the British government. About 3 months later, they're going to pass one more law that is really going to drive people up a wall, and that's going to be in May of 1774, and it's called the Quebec Act. So Quebec is a place in Canada, if you've never heard of Quebec before. So what this does is it extends the Quebec boundary. So it basically grants more land to the territory of Quebec. Now, why is that such a huge problem for the colonists? Why are they going to be up in arms about this? Well, number one, they're up in arms about this because it's giving land that they won in the French and Indian War to the French. So this is sort of like a big FU to the colonists from the British government. It's taking something that they worked hard for to get from the French, and it's basically giving it back to their enemy. Even though the British government doesn't like the French, they're giving it to the French here. Number two, it also limits their security against the French. It's the buffer zone between French military and the colonists now is even smaller. So the likelihood that they could have some violent altercations with French colonists or French government or French military is much higher. In addition to that, it allows the national religion in that area to be Catholicism. Overall, unless you lived in Maryland, being Catholic was not really acceptable in the colonies. So that was another thing people were mad about. They were like, oh my gosh, is the British government going back to Catholicism? What is going on? And people were very, very upset, very confused. And overall, this just adds to the fire that has been created by the Intolerable Acts. So Thomas Jefferson is going to come onto the scene here in that same time period. He's going to become a household name. During all of this, he writes a pamphlet called The Summary View of the Rights of British America. Basically, what that means is he's talking about the rights of the people who live in the colonies. And in this pamphlet, he defends the Boston Tea Party as the action of a desperate people struggling to protect their basic rights as citizens. And he essentially says that right now, the rights of British America are being stripped away from them little by little by the British government, which is currently acting like a tyrannical, corrupt organization. And we've got to start standing up for ourselves, and we've got to do something about this. So this pamphlet circles its way throughout the colonies, and it's going to put Thomas Jefferson on the map. People are going to know who Thomas Jefferson is starting in August of 1774 when they start reading this pamphlet. It's really surprising to hear someone say all of these things, edging people almost towards independence, not quite. But someone really saying, what's happening right now should basically be illegal. The government is a corrupt government. That's a big thing to say. It's treasonous in some people's eyes. So it's really going to make him a spokesperson for the colonial rights movement that is about to take place. So when all of this is going on, it's very clear that something needs to happen. People are reading Thomas Jefferson's pamphlet. More and more people are getting upset. Words about what has happened to Boston is getting around, and people are just absolutely livid. So a group of men in the colonies decide that all of the colonies need to meet, and they're going to meet in Philadelphia. Every colony will send delegates except one, and the one that does not send any delegates is Georgia. So every other colony sends delegates, and they all meet in Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia starting in September of 1774. This is attended by both moderates, loyalists, and radicals, everyone in between. There are moderates like John Adams and more radicals like Patrick Henry, who are all present at the Continental Congress and ready to discuss what the next move should be here. So at this meeting, what they do is they decide that every colony will get one vote. Massachusetts won't get more votes than South Carolina just because they have more people living there. And Virginia won't get more votes than Delaware just because they have more land. Every colony will get one vote no matter what. So that is a good way to sort of start all this off. Equal say. Every colony will essentially have to agree. So in this meeting of the First Continental Congress, they're going to adopt a Declaration of Rights that John Adams writes. This is not the Declaration of Independence, but they do write this document, or John Adams writes this document, and it basically condemns all of these recent acts by Parliament. So you can really compare it to the Declaration of Rights and Grievances that they wrote at the Stamp Act Congress. It essentially says that what Parliament has been doing is unconstitutional, dangerous, destructive, all of the above. He also talks about how it's the government's job to protect life, liberty, and property. If that sounds familiar, they stole that from John Locke. They also call for the repeal of the Intolerable Acts, as well as every other tax that had been levied by the British Crown. They want all of the taxes to be taken away. And then at the bottom, they say that until this happens, they're going to stop all British imports and most British exports. And this is going to be enforced by local committees within each colony. So like North Carolina is going to enforce the not buying things from Great Britain and selling very minimal things to Great Britain. So if you're wondering why they're not stopping all trade with, like, why are we only selling minimal things? That's because they still need that income, right? Like there are some, like farmers or people like that, let's say tobacco farmers or cotton farmers in the South, who rely on the income of selling their product to Great Britain. And they don't want to punish the colonial farmers. They're trying to punish the British government. So that's why they're still allowing the sale of certain colonial goods to the British government. So the next thing that they're going to do after writing out this, list of demands is they're going to form a group called the Minutemen. The Minutemen are not, a group of teenagers who go back in time like you might have seen on the Disney Channel. The Minutemen are colonial soldiers. Soldiers is a loose term, but they are colonial soldiers who will be ready to fight in a minute, at a moment's notice against the British military. Now, these are all volunteer people, and this is not a formally trained military. That's why I'm saying soldier is a loose term. The Minutemen are largely farmers and, just like regular colonists who, know that it's very possible that they are going to need protection from the British government soon, from British soldiers soon, so they want to be there to volunteer for that when the time comes. So they create the Minutemen and they write up this Declaration of Rights, and they agree that they will meet again in May. May of 1775 is when they agree to come back. But some things will draw them back just a few weeks early, and that's going to be the outbreak of war. So in April of 1775, this man you see on the slide, General Gage, will arrive in the colonies, sent by the British government to begin basically, I don't want to say putting down a rebellion because a full-on rebellion hasn't started yet, but he's essentially there to, announce the British military's presence and keep a hold on things. And things are really going to come to a head between him and the colonists in April of 1775. He's going to send 700 troops to Concord. Concord is in Massachusetts. He's sending these troops to Concord because they have a supply of guns and ammunition there's an arsenal there, or an armory there, sorry, that is holding all of their supplies and things like that for the Minutemen. And Gage is like, hey, I want those for myself, and if I've got them, that means the colonists don't have them, which is also good for me. So I'm going to send some soldiers to Concord to steal all that stuff. So it's supposed to be a surprise attack, but unfortunately for General Gage, someone is going to find out about it, and that someone is Dr. Joseph Warren. Dr. Joseph Warren is a son of liberty. How does Dr. Joseph Warren find out? He is hooking up with the wife of a British soldier, and she's like, hey, guess what I just found out from my husband? The soldiers are going to, raid this arsenal of yours in Concord. And Warren is like, oh crap, we got to stop. So he calls up all his friends, and he gets a group of about 30 guys to ride through the area all the way from where they are to Concord, warning everyone that the Redcoats are coming. The Redcoats are coming. And if you could name just one of the men who makes this ride, it would probably be Paul Revere. Yes, this is Paul Revere's ride. Now, Paul Revere does not even make the longest ride that night. As I just said, he's not even the only one. There are 30 people riding that night. Some of them are even women. So the only reason we remember Paul Revere is actually because he had a poem written about him called The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, and it became very, very famous, and because of that, we remember Paul Revere more than anyone else. But I don't want you to think that he did any more than anyone else did that night. He didn't. Now, he definitely, pulled his fair share. He was a son of liberty. He, made his ride that night, but he was not like the savior of the day. So alarm bells are ringing all over the place, and most people in Concord had fled the city all the way. They had fled to most people in Lexington had fled because Lexington is on the way to Concord. So everyone who's sort of in that path is leaving because they want to get out of the way of the British because they don't want to get hurt. The only people that remained in Lexington were about 70 Minutemen, and they were staying behind to block the advance of the British to Concord. The British and soldiers and the Minutemen meet, and the Minutemen quickly realize that they are significantly outnumbered. And they begin to, get ready to run away, essentially. They've got to retreat. But somehow someone fires a shot. We're not sure if a British soldier fired at the Minutemen or if a Minuteman fired at the British soldiers. We're not sure who fired that shot, but it became known as the shot heard around the world. This is the first shot fired from one of these militaries against the other, and that marks the beginning of the War for Independence. So right here, this is where the war really is going to begin. No one has declared war on anyone, but this is when battle and the military aspect of all of this is going to start. So there in Lexington, 8 Minutemen die, and the rest of them retreat, and they head on to Concord because they want to cut off the British. And they manage to cut the British off at the Old North Bridge. It's very a famous place now because it's where they're able to stop the British. But they managed to stop them at the Old North Bridge. When the Redcoats then turn around and head towards Boston, the Minutemen had people basically like guerrilla warfare style fighting them, like jumping out of trees, attacking them like street style fighting, not like line up in a row and shoot each other type fighting. And with this surprise attack, guerrilla warfare style fighting, they're able to defeat the British that are on the way to Boston also. So in the end, the British lose around 300 men. And so collectively, we called this the battles of Lexington and Concord. And it is a colonial victory, which is a huge deal. So now that this has happened, the War for Independence is officially on.